Franklin D. Roosevelt won the 1932 election with a massive mandate to rescue the country from depression. By March 1933, 25% of the workforce was unemployed. Almost 13 million Americans had lost their jobs and faced a very uncertain future. Thousands of banks had failed. Farming income had collapsed. Every city and major town had soup kitchens to help people avoid starvation. Amid all this confusion and chaos, Roosevelt chose to give a speech which was encouraging and inspiring. He promised a new deal. He said, "This great nation will endure as it has endured, will revive and will prosper. So let me assert my firm belief the only thing we have to fear is fear itself." Despite such fighting words, no one knew exactly what he meant by the New Deal. Roosevelt was neither a liberal nor a conservative, but pledged to save capitalism by common-sense reforms based on pragmatism. However, within 2 days of becoming president, he took decisive action. On the 6th of March 1933, he declared a national bank holiday, closing all banks for a week. He called Congress into emergency session, aiming to enact emergency banking legislation which would restore confidence to the banking system. All banks would remain closed until the government analysed them and permanently closed the bad ones. The more prudent banks were allowed to reopen, and a couple of days later, Roosevelt went on radio on the first of his radio fireside chats to assure millions of Americans that their money would be safe in the reopened banks. It was a good start. Within 2 months, millions of savers had returned over $1,000 million to the banking system. In June 1933, Congress passed the Glass-Steagall Act, which made banking much more secure as it separated commercial banking from investment banking. This was a large part of the problem in previous years, where banks had invested people's savings in high-risk stocks and shares on the stock market to maximise profits. The new act blocked this type of activity from ever happening again. It also guaranteed people's savings through the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. Reform of the banking system, however, was only one part of the solution needed to revive the economy. Millions were unemployed or had lost their jobs and their savings in banks due to bank failures. Hundreds of thousands lived in shanty towns on the brink of starvation. Capitalism itself seemed to be on the brink of collapse as alternative political systems in Europe and Russia seemed to offer another alternative. Roosevelt responded to this situation in his inaugural address by assuring Americans of the potential greatness of their country, that these times of extreme distress would pass. In the weeks and months that followed, he established several relief programs to meet the immediate needs and crisis that was the dire needs of the nation's unemployed. The Federal Emergency Relief Administration made direct cash allocations available to the states for immediate payment to the unemployed. The Civilian Conservation Corps employed over 300 young men in public work program around the country. In rural America, the Agricultural Adjustment Act paid farmers to reduce production as new farm machinery in recent years had caused massive overproduction and a collapse in the price of farm products and incomes. The Agricultural Adjustment Act, however, failed to bring much relief to the poor of rural America, as big farmers gained most from subsidies to cut production, while the smaller farmers and sharecroppers remained destitute. This development witnessed the beginning of mass migration of the poor to the major towns and cities as dust storms and low incomes combined to make life extremely difficult. However, for those that remained on the land, the Adjustment Act did improve their income levels, as the new advent of electricity, another offspring of the recovery actually, made life better with the availability of lights, radios and washing machines. The recovery program also financed the huge Tennessee Valley Authority. Here, a huge poor region stretching from Virginia to Mississippi was revitalized by the construction of huge dams, huge power plants, bridges, roads and flood control systems, which brought thousands of jobs and renewed vitality to the region. Roosevelt also aimed to revive industry by creating a partnership between industry and the federal government. The National Industrial Recovery Act was passed by Congress in June 1933. Created two major government agencies, the Public Works Administration and the National Recovery Administration. The PWA created over 8 million jobs over the next decade. It built 4,000 schools, 130 hospitals, 29,000 bridges and over 280,000 miles of new roads. The government became the nation's biggest employer. The big business elites and their economists claimed Roosevelt was destroying American free enterprise and driving the country towards socialism. However, Roosevelt responded to such criticism by stating, "I welcome their hatred," and went on to win 4 presidential elections. The National Recovery Administration aimed to compel American industry to follow new codes and standards in regard to work practices, hours worked, prices and wages. However, the National Recovery Program to a large extent failed to achieve most of these targets as businesses ignored their guidelines. However, by the mid-30s, some aspects of the New Deal had run into trouble. In 1935, the Supreme Court struck down the Industrial Recovery Act on the basis that Congress had given away too much of its power to the executive function of government. Roosevelt feared that the court could actually unravel the entire New Deal and sought to rectify this situation by replacing all judges over the age of 75. However, this plan failed as both Congress and the media and the public resisted such proposals. In regard to Social Security, the government defended the new act on the basis of the implied powers of the Constitution, and the court accepted this approach, stating that the hope behind this statute is to save men and women from the rigours of the workhouse. Henceforward, the Supreme Court upheld all future New Deal acts. Roosevelt also began to experience much criticism of his plans from more radical left-wing alternatives. Senator Huey Long of Louisiana wanted the wealthy taxed and the money shared among the poor. Father Charles Coughlin ran a massive radio campaign to expand the money supply based on silver. And Dr. Francis Townsend argued in favour of a federally funded pension scheme for the elderly. Partly in response to these critics, Roosevelt developed the Social Security system of the mid-1930s. Gerald Swoop, president of the General Electric Company, played a central role in developing the details of the plan. In April 1935, Congress passed and the President signed the Social Security Bill into law. Roosevelt also had his conservative critics. Among them was Governor Allen Landon of Kansas, who became the Republican nominee in 1936. However, the New Deal was overwhelmingly popular at this stage with voters, and Roosevelt won a second landslide victory, this time in November 1936. Roosevelt gave his second inaugural address on 20th of January 1937. The date had been changed, moved back from the 4th of March, so that the presidential term started about 6 weeks earlier than normal. In his speech, he felt confident that the worst of the recession was over. Growth, productivity and employment levels had all increased in recent years. However, halfway through 1937, a deep recession hit. Suddenly, total production levels dropped by 10%, unemployment went back up to 20%, and the stock market actually dropped by 1/3. Many have called this the Roosevelt recession. It was caused mainly by an attempt to balance the books, to spend less. This was in line with Keynesian economics, which recommends the government should spend less once the economy picks up. However, some Keynesian economists believe Roosevelt acted too early. By early 1938, Roosevelt reversed engines, expanded government programs again, which reduced unemployment and also contributed to his win in the 1938 midterm elections. However, it was the outbreak of the Second World War, with a massive increase in production of vans, cars, lorries, aeroplanes, munitions and military vehicles, which eventually helped to both win the war and return the United States to full employment. In regard to foreign policy, for the first 8 years of his presidency, Roosevelt was mainly focused on reviving the economy, but it was impossible to ignore the international situation, given that Hitler had come to power at roughly the same time in Germany. Roosevelt also rejected Herbert Hoover's belief that the Depression was mainly caused by international factors and that the essential thing was to move all the major economies back onto the gold standard. Instead, the new president followed other countries' lead and took America off the gold standard in his first year in office. In the early years of his presidency, he also conducted a number of trade agreements with other nations to increase US exports and employment, so that by the mid-1930s he had also established official relations with the Soviet Union. In regard to Latin America, Roosevelt developed further the good neighbour policy started by Herbert Hoover. Events in Europe forced him to realise that they might need these countries as friends in the coming decade. In 1933, at the Pan American Conference, the United States supported a resolution which stated that no country had the right to interfere in the internal affairs of another country. This was a significant change from the policy set out by Theodore Roosevelt 30 years earlier. Like Hoover before him, Roosevelt also refused to recognise the conquest of Manchuria by Japan in 1931, as it was contrary to the Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928. Japan aimed to establish what they called a Greater East Asian co-prosperity sphere in their region. In regard to Europe, there was also concern about Italy's invasion of Ethiopia in 1935. However, of greatest concern was Germany's expansion plans and Hitler's demand for more living space in Eastern Europe. In the midst of all this turmoil, however, the United States adopted a strong policy of neutrality. Memories were still fresh of the horrendous deaths, injuries and chaos caused by the First World War, a European conflict in which millions of Americans believed they should never have been involved in the first place. In response to this feeling, Congress passed 4 neutrality acts between 1935 and 1939, which forbade American involvement in foreign conflicts. For the most part in the 1930s, Roosevelt went along with this isolationist sentiment and won a third term in 1940, mainly on the basis of keeping America out of the war. However, by the middle of 1940, Germany had overrun most of Europe, including France. Britain stood alone in defiance of Hitler. Churchill was in frequent touch with Roosevelt, attempting to bring America into the war. Roosevelt pledged to support Britain with all aid short of war. In 1939, Roosevelt had won a revision of one of the Neutrality Acts which allowed the US to supply arms to other countries on a cash and carry basis. In September 1940, Roosevelt agreed to supply Britain with 50 destroyer battleships in return for 8 British military bases. This was a popular decision and it helped him to win the 1940 election 2 months later. In March 1941, the United States went further with their Lend-Lease program, whereby they supplied food, oil and munitions to Britain and escorted their ships in the North Atlantic. This support was justified as a defence of American democratic principles. Lend-Lease was also extended to the Soviet Union after Pearl Harbor was attacked in December 1941. In 1940, Hitler attacked Britain by air and by sea, but failed to defeat them, partly due to the support of the United States. By 1941, the US Navy also supported British ships carrying Lend-Lease materials and escorting them in the North Atlantic and attacking German submarines. Over 100 US sailors were killed in these exchanges, but anti-war sentiment in the States remained strong. In a sense, by mid-1941, America was at war with Germany in all but name, and Roosevelt was deliberately evasive when asked to define what he meant by everything short of war. In August 1941, Churchill and Roosevelt met in Newfoundland. They agreed the Atlantic Charter. It represented their vision of the post-war world. Stalin later agreed to join it. This was, in effect, the birth of the United Nations. Following the Japanese attack on China in 1937, the US, Britain and the Dutch isolated Japan from access to important raw materials, and Japan felt restricted by the Western powers as it tried to develop its own Asian sphere of influence. In the summer of 1941, Japan attacked Indochina, and the US responded with further restrictions and actually froze Japanese assets in the United States itself. By late 1941, Japan felt hemmed in and financially undermined by Western restrictions, and on the 6th of December 1941 they attacked Pearl Harbor, which brought America directly into the war. In early 1942, the United States suffered heavy defeats in the Philippines and in the Java Sea. However, by May and June they had recovered and won important victories in the Coral Sea and in the Battle of Midway Island. As 1942 progressed, the Germans failed to take Moscow, while America and British ships destroyed German submarines in the North Atlantic, mainly due to superior technology. By 1943, the tide was turning against Germany and Japan as the full force of American production made its presence felt on the battlefields and at sea. A joint Anglo-American attack on Italy took place in the summer of 1943. In November 1943, the Big Three, Churchill, Roosevelt and Stalin, met at Tehran in Iran. Roosevelt and Churchill promised Stalin to invade France, and Stalin agreed to join the United Nations as envisaged in the Atlantic Charter. On the 6th of June 1944, D-Day, Eisenhower landed in France as Supreme Commander of the combined US and Allied forces. During the fall of 1944, they swept across France, and by early 1945 were beginning to advance on Germany. In January 1943, the Big Three met again, this time at Yalta in Crimea, to decide what the post-war world would look like. Stalin was angry that D-Day had been delayed so long. The Soviet Union was devastated by the war. They had lost 23 million people, as opposed to 900,000 British and 298,000 Americans. The three leaders agreed that Germany would be divided into four spheres of influence, controlled by the United States, Britain, France and the Soviet Union. Stalin also promised to hold free elections in countries they captured from Germany. However, countries such as Poland, Romania, Bulgaria and Hungary remained under communist rule for the next 45 years. Roosevelt gave the green light to the Manhattan Project in 1942, which created the atomic bomb. It was a difficult decision, but he recognized the possibility of Germany or the Soviet Union doing likewise. Roosevelt did not witness its use or the end of the war. He died of a stroke on the 12th of April 1945. Adolf Hitler committed suicide 3 weeks later. Roosevelt is considered by historians as among the greatest of US presidents, on a par with Washington or Lincoln. He steered a middle course during the Great Depression at a time when extremely destructive governments came to power in Europe and Russia. He also won the war and left his country with a thriving economy and by far the most powerful nation in the world.